my initial entree to sort of the Vincentian world, if not St. Vincent de Paul Madison, was when I was in college. I managed to take a course on sainthood, and it was, like to say, it wasn't a how-to. It was an academic course with a renowned medievalist and great experience. But I happened to choose St. Vincent de Paul as the subject of my final 10-page paper, and was impressed by what I came to understand about him as the patron saint of organized charity, more or less. And a couple of years later, I found myself in grad school for journalism and mass comm, and was in a class where I needed to write articles that I would actually submit for publication, and the expectation was that they would get published and that our grades were dependent upon it, sort of. And I thought, I've got that one paper I wrote a couple of years ago, research paper. I bet I could twist that around into an article that's interesting enough. And I did, and submitted it to to Ligorian, a Catholic magazine, and they sent me $375, as I recall, or somewhere in that vicinity. Well, a couple of months later, still a struggling grad student, I found myself $75 short on the rent 5 days into my landlord's grace period, and I was trying to figure out how am I going to make this work, and I went downstairs from my apartment, checked the mailbox on my way out to class, took out an envelope, and in it was an unsolicited $75 check for a reprint rights to St. Vincent de Paul, patron saint of organized charity, from Catholic Digest. And I thought, you've got a sense of humor, So I was well disposed toward St. Vincent de Paul on that basis. But my real entree into St. Vincent de Paul in Madison was a program that is not a St. Vincent de Paul program per se, but is one of the major meal programs here in Madison, Luke House, the community meal program. I've been involved with that for many years, and was co-founded by Paul Ash and Ralph Middlecamp. Ralph Middlecamp became the longtime general manager, executive director and CEO of St. Vincent de Paul, and my predecessor and boss. But I met Ralph through that program. Turned around one day on one of my group's evening meals, and somebody said, "Hi, Ralph." And I said, "Oh, so you're Ralph Middlecamp." And he roped me into committees quickly, and initially had involvement with the early, in fact, the first Recycle the Warmth blanket drive that the Society has mounted in this area for 34 years now. And from there, I got involved in other committees. I headed up the store committee for a time, which is one of the standing committees. Got embroiled in what was a new standing committee in the early part of the millennium called Image and Development. I came from a public relations and public affairs background and knew some of how the Society wanted to amp up its local public relations and communications activity. And from there, I later decided to leave a job I had with AAA for about 17 years at the state level AAA. And I understood what St. Vincent de Paul locally wanted to do, what Ralph's plans and his team's plans were for sort of increasing level of communication that the society conducted locally. And I approached him when I was considering that. I said, would you like to be a cut rate client? And he said, I'd prefer an employment relationship, which put me in a bind, frankly, because I was figuring on hanging out my own shingle, and did. But I also went to work half-time for the society as, eventually we called it Director of Community Relations, which was a kind of position that the society hadn't had before. It was more a function of the executive director. So I did that from 2005 to 2012. 2012, I think Ralph sort of seeing where he wanted to go next, and with retirement impending, asked me to take on a full-time basis, the associate executive director position, which was a new role. And I gradually said yes and went full-time and did that from 2012 to 2017, when at some point during 2017, Ralph did two things, which were to indicate that he was planning to retire, and the other that he was planning to run for the position of our national president. We had never had a national president who was elected, and it is an elected position, who was elected from among St. Vincent de Paul staff. And he was so well regarded in the organization more broadly, he was elected. And but he had to retire to do that. He can't serve in that role as a staff member. It's a volunteer gig. So I took over after his retirement, and the very first day that I was in the executive director or CEO position, all the power went out in this building. A breaker that shouldn't have broken in this Middlecamp Center for Vincentian Charity, shouldn't have broken in 50 years, went south, and we had to take 3 days to get a new one out of Pennsylvania. And it was lost on no one that the power had left the building when Ralph did. So, and we had a party for him that night, and he thought that was funny too. So, so that's my trajectory. I was in two roles here that were new to the organization. And the first was as Director of Community Relations, essentially doing public relations and communications for the organization. And it was a kind of role that I had experience in with other organizations, but with the new twist that I was, doing it for an organization that historically didn't like to toot its own horn, and yet has any number of reasons to do so, but mainly to garner the generosity of a cooperative community and helping neighbors in need. So there was sort of it wasn't all that difficult in the sense that the organization has a good story to tell about the help that it provides to the folks it serves. So, I was just there to sort of pick out the pieces that were most compelling and help people understand them, and also to help ramp up the organization's outreach on a fundraising basis. By telling those stories. So that was one role. The other role was as Associate Executive Director. I was the first one to fill that position. And it was, backstopping Ralph, my boss, the Executive Director and CEO, in his very busy role, and, taking on some of what could be handled by somebody else usefully. And so, I had him to look to provide the direction for that. And hopefully that went well most days. Ralph was an excellent mentor and remains so. I mean, he's just finished a term of 6 years as our national president, and now he's our first international vice president. So, he maintains his important leadership capacity within the St. Vincent de Paul family. St. Vincent de Paul, locally and internationally, is a membership organization. That's often opaque to the general public, even the folks who commonly support us. But at its base, it grew out of a small group of college students at the Sorbonne in the 1830s who got together to serve people in need in Paris at a time of great industrial revolution turmoil, and it grew globally from there. But the way it grew essentially was as an organization of caring people, providing help, resources, companionship, friendship, ultimately, to people in need. They would go and still do go seek and find the forgotten, the suffering, and the deprived, and try to serve them with dignity and try by seeing the face of Christ in the people that we're called to serve. When you're among people whose motivation is that, to provide dignified service and resources to people struggling to make ends meet, you're with a pretty nice bunch. Not that we don't have our travails and, our headbutting, but overall, there are just a whole bunch of really good folks who are a pleasure to be around typically. So that keeps our members coming back. In general, I think it keeps folks who served in a staff capacity like me embroiled and helping to support the efforts of those people who are on a daily basis doing home visits and volunteering in a food pantry, helping at a pharmacy, and otherwise meeting the needs of people who need their help. I retired in late 2022, but I'm still a member of my own conference called the Christ the King Conference in McFarland. And I helped form that with some other friends there back in 2005. So, we do what other conferences, 18 of them in Dane County, do, which is go out and do home visits with people who request assistance and volunteer for various programs that the district council, the next level up, conducts, like the food pantry and the pharmacy. And so I still am engaged in some committee efforts and in my own conferences. I think what I'm most proud of in my service here with St. Vincent de Paul as a staff member is actually dealing with a significant problem, which was the pandemic. The pandemic happened during my tenure as CEO for SVDP Madison. And for an organization that is engaged in person-to-person service, both at the hyper-local level through our member conferences around the county and at the level of the district council that runs the food pantry and the pharmacy and ran housing programs. The pandemic was a great challenge. It was a great challenge to all of us who lived through it, no doubt, but the fact that we're engaged in providing direct service to people in need became all the more difficult in situations where it was difficult to be around other people, or have people coming into a workplace that served hundreds of people each week. So what we ended up doing was writing on protocols for safety, like a lot of organizations did, and masking and doing social distancing, and letting people who could go home, and closing our stores for a period of time, which meant that the resources were that we rely on, both to give away and to sell to support our mission, were at a low ebb. So despite having to do that, we needed still to provide the kind of services that people depend upon us for. The home visits, which often became telephone visits, even though our more general proclivity is to do that face-to-face, or to do them socially distanced at a picnic table in a park, or in the case of the pantry, to move service outside, and it's still outside. And part of the reasons outside is the little grocery store-like pantry that we ran for years and that was innovative in its time has not been able in that mode to serve the numbers that we've found during the pandemic and since. So we did service outside, even with the pharmacy. The pharmacy, which had to briefly also close because of a case of COVID that no one suffered too much from, but we had to obey our own protocols. But when we reopened after a handful of days, we served outside. We would run prescriptions outside, and consults were done by cell phone or by iPad. So we adapted in a number of ways, and most of them were relatively successful, but it wasn't easy, and wasn't fun, but it was necessary, and we still managed to serve people. And the community, I think, intuited that organizations like ours that involved in direct service to local people struggling with poverty needed all the more help during the pandemic. So I won't say we were flush with cash so much as some of the ways in which we were lacking resources by dint of having, for a couple of months, as I recall, having to close our stores, were made up for in part by the community responding generously to appeals we made for assistance. And so people gave, and we're still dependent on people giving, and so that the support of this community, its generosity, is key to this organization serving in the way that it does. The most important influence on my leadership at St. Vincent de Paul Madison has been Ralph Middlecamp, who was my predecessor. He served this organization for about 31 years. And the way he likes to put it is when he was part of a community called La Samaritan, a Christian commune that initially owned the community meal program and Luke House, that he was sort of sent to infiltrate the organization. And as he puts it, it infiltrated him. But Ralph Middlecamp was and remains a remarkable Vincentian leader. He is somebody who started out as the store manager for St. Vincent de Paul when the organization had one store, built the organization to 7 stores toward a central locus of service in the service center and food pantry, pharmacy that we now call the Middlecamp Center for Vincentian Charity. and managed to serve the committee, and especially Ralph managed to serve the community, and especially people struggling with poverty here in ways that promoted the dignity of those who came to St. Vincent de Paul for service. That was palpable in his service, and I could see that, when I had committee involvements, that's the kind of guy he was and the kind of leadership he provided, and it's the kind of people he attracted to the organization as members, as folks providing service on committees, and among the staff that he attracted to serve here. So his leadership was key in informing my own, and I'm not saying I lived up to it so much as I benefited from it. And I have to say, too, that the other model of leadership that I found as a Vincentian to be crucial is that of Blessed Frederick Ozanam. Blessed Frederick, a Catholic blessed, somebody on their path to canonization, and God bless him. He already is a saint, but someday that'll be recognized, I think, by the church. But Frederick, as a 20-year-old college student with a bunch of college buddies at the Sorbonne in France, formed the Society of St. Vincent de Paul as an answer to the challenge of what has your church done for the people lately. Maybe it's got a history of serving in charity, but what are you doing now? And his answer to that was to form what became called the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. We weren't formed by St. Vincent de Paul or founded by St. Vincent de Paul. He's our patron. But Frederick and 5 college friends and an older adult mentor who was all of 37 helped those young folks begin the society, and it grew globally very rapidly. It was in St. Louis by the society was founded in 1833. It grew very rapidly. It was in St. Louis by 1845. It was in Milwaukee by 1848. And it's global now, 155 countries. And even though it's in some ways quiet, that network of charity that Frederick started serves in 155 countries. And it's the largest lay organization in the Catholic Church. It involves a lot of non-Catholics, too. So Frederick's leadership of the organization early is a model for all of us as Vincentians. I was fortunate to be able to bring on as my associate executive director, Julie Bennett. And it was a competitive process when that position opened. And we had a number of very skilled applicants. Julie happened to be somebody I already knew, and a neighbor from McFarland, somebody whose spouse was a fellow member of my own conference. When the position became open, she came to mind, but before I had a chance to call her, she applied. And our board ended up hiring her, and I think they were very wise. I told our board that I felt Julie had the capacity to be a transformational leader of the organization. She was already showing that as associate executive director. And they saw that wisdom and hired her as CEO and executive director. And in the past couple of years that she's been serving in that capacity, I think she's proven that statement or prediction true. and I expect she'll continue to be. And I hope I've been of help to her when needed. And occasionally she'll pick my brain. I have enough history where now that I'm in the archives, I think once in a while I can provide some useful insight. But she's taken the Vincentian ball and run with it here locally. And I know she finds a lot of benefit too from other people in similar positions across the country, and consults with them as executive directors of other St. Vincent de Paul councils across the nation. So she's doing good work, and it's really gratifying to me to have somebody in the role that I feel confident will continue to be a strong leader for the organization. If I might mention, she was able to hire Amy Overby as her associate executive director. So that was very lucky too. Amy's somebody I've known for years, and brings a remarkable skill set to the organization too. So we've been lucky. We managed to attract good people over years, and a whole lot of that begins with Ralph Middlecamp. One thing I found over the years is sort of the commonality between the people serving through St. Vincent de Paul as members, as pantry volunteers, in the pharmacy, and the people being served. There was one instance where I was working as a volunteer on the blanket drive. I may have been staff at this point, I'm not sure, but the annual Recycle the Warmth blanket drive used to take place at Chopco's. And we would garner blankets and bedding, used and new, that we'd give away all year long, but we'd do it in winter as a reminder of the need, more or less. And a friend, a fellow conference member, ended up bringing a fellow over to me who was dressed in, let's say, work clothes, sort of a green work shirt, and looked like maybe he, was a mechanic or carpenter, or, something along those lines. And she said that the gentleman had been asking her a number of questions about the services the organization provides, and her impression was that he needed help, and she thought I could explain better what the range of services that we provide were. Turned out he was asking because he wanted to make a contribution and wanted to know better what he'd be supporting. He ended up buying $900 worth of blankets that day, and subsequently his family foundation made thousands of dollars worth of contributions over years. And part of what that impressed upon me is you just never know, who it is who needs help, and who it is that is capable of providing help. One of the salient insights that our members tend to have from home visits is that they come away with more than they entered the home with, that they're actually edified and served, as it were, by the people they're trying to serve. And that's a key aspect of the Vincentian charism of what we're called to do, which is to see the dignity of the people we're serving and understand that in them we see the face of Christ. So St. Vincent de Paul used to say, the poor are your masters. So it's sort of it's an extension of that. There's a saying in the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. It's usually attributed to our founder, our primary founder, Frederick Ozanam, that no act of charity is foreign to the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. I remember one year during the pandemic when we moved the locus of our blanket drive to the service center here, the Center for Vincentian Charity. We collected blankets at a drive-through event here at the service center rather than at Shopko, which I think maybe had gone out of business by that time. And we were also collecting at area churches and at our own stores, but the primary locus was here at the service center. And somebody pulled up into a slot to drop off blankets, and their tire went flat. So a bunch of us got the individual popper trunk. We got the jack out, and we changed her tire. So, there were a number of people who observed that, no act of charity is foreign to the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. So we will change tires on occasion. I think one of the most important things I've learned from my time with the Society of St. Vincent de Paul is that there's a commonality between those called to serve and those who are served, because we all need help at times, and we're all capable of providing it. There's the notion, and in fact the tagline, as it were, of the society locally, that we serve our neighbors in need. And that notion of neighbor is crucial to what we do. There's a painting, actually, it's a large print in this building, the Middlecamp Center for Vincentian Charity, up on the second floor. It's a Rembrandt of the Good Samaritan, of that parable. It's not a real Rembrandt, but in any case, it's large, and Ralph Middlecamp, my predecessor, had it put there in order to emphasize the notion of service to neighbor in need. Because the Good Samaritan, although he was not a direct neighbor to the person who had been robbed that he ends up helping, is an answer to what it means to be a neighbor. In that parable, Jesus is initially asked, "Who is my neighbor?" And the answer in that parable is, go and do likewise. Go do like the Good Samaritan. Be a neighbor. So being a neighbor is the essence of the Vincentian charism, and it recognizes the dignity of the other person, the person who's being served, and that in some other capacity, the table is turned, that the person who is being helped, the person in whom the Vincentian is seeing the face of Christ, is actually serving and increasing the spirituality and the holiness of the person who's called to provide the service. So I think that's the core lesson that I've learned from being a member of the society. I'd say the way that my experience of St. Vincent de Paul has changed how I view community service is that the best community service is personal. We don't cast ourselves as the society, or as St. Vincent de Paul Madison, primarily as a social services agency. We instead see ourselves as an organization providing person-to-person service wherever we can. Even those aspects in which sort of efficiency becomes a goal, like serving as many people as we can through a food pantry on a busy day. We still try to make that service as personal as we can and provide as much dignity to the process as we can. So offering community service in a way that's personal, that recognizes the humanity of both the person served and the person serving in relationship with each other is core to this organization. So I've learned that. In terms of what I've learned about philanthropy in regard to St. Vincent de Paul, is that even a quiet organization needs to toot its own horn, needs to tell the good that it's doing. Sort of the scriptural example is to not hide a light under a bushel basket. The organization locally is 100 years old now. And even telling stories as I'm doing now is a case in point of recognizing the value that the organization has provided to people in need locally and to its members who've grown in their own holiness by doing that over years. Telling that story is part of what creates sustainability for that organization to do more good over another century or as long as needed. The philanthropy that we seek, the generosity that we're able to call upon the community for, comes about in no small part by telling the stories of the good the organization accomplishes. The organization's next 100 years, I hope, won't always be focused on material poverty. It'd be great if that went away. Jesus said, "The poor you'll always have with you." What I think he meant by that was, hey, there's need right here, right now. He says, me you'll not always have. Serve the individual. Serve the person, whatever their needs are. Maybe someday material poverty will be a thing we look upon as a thing of the past, of the brutal 20th and 21st century. But there'll always be need. There'll always be poverty of sorts. Even now we find ourselves called upon to meet the poverty of loneliness, for instance, with people who our members visit in their homes who have fairly limited human contacts sometimes. So I would advise the St. Vincent de Paul members and leaders of the future to seek and find poverty, even if it's not material, wherever they find it, and to meet that need.